In March 1944, a handful of shipwrecked sailors clung desperately to debris in the moonlit Atlantic, the wreckage of their ship bobbing in the waves around them. Out of the darkness, a German U-boat surfaced, not to rescue them, but to eliminate them. Gunfire shattered the silence as the submarine's crew opened up with machine guns and tossed hand grenades into the water. It was a shocking breach of the laws of war at sea, a deliberate massacre of survivors known as the Peleus incident. This act would make U-852 infamous as the only U-boat in World War II whose crew intentionally killed shipwrecked Allied survivors. What led the crew to commit such a heinous act, and how did justice finally catch up with them? Explore the design and mission of U-852, the fateful sinking of the SS Peleus, the harrowing survivor accounts, and the dramatic pursuit, capture, and post-war trial that cemented the Peleus affair as a pivotal case in the history of naval warfare and law. U-852 was a newly built German long-range submarine, a Type 9D2 U-boat commissioned in mid-1943. Significantly larger than the more common Type 7 U-boats, the Type 9D2 was designed for extended operations across distant seas. U-852 stretched nearly 88 meters in length, or 287 feet, and displaced about 1,600 tons on the surface. It carried 6 torpedo tubes, 4 in the bow and 2 in the stern, and even featured a novel piece of technology, a Bachstelze-Fahr 330 rotor kite, a one-man gyrocopter that could be towed aloft to scout for targets over the horizon. This cutting-edge equipment underscored U-852's special role. The man entrusted with U-852 was Captain Lieutenant Heinz-Wilhelm Eck, a 27-year-old career naval officer. Born in Hamburg in 1916, Eck had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1934 and risen through the ranks during the war. By December 1941, he had earned his promotion to Captain Lieutenant, and in June 1943, he received his first command, the brand new U-852. Though young, Eck was a seasoned sailor who had spent nearly a decade in the German Navy. He took U-852 through its sea trials and training with the 4th U-boat flotilla, preparing for the boat's maiden war patrol in early 1944. In January, U-852 departed on its first and only combat patrol, assigned to the 12th U-boat flotilla for active service. The mission was top secret and ambitious. The Kriegsmarine was dispatching a handful of long-range U-boats to the Indian Ocean to disrupt Allied shipping far from Europe's well-patrolled waters. U-852 was to join the so-called Monsoon Group operating out of bases in Southeast Asia. To reach those distant hunting grounds, Eck's submarine would have to slip past Allied air patrols and naval forces while rounding the Cape of Good Hope, a journey of thousands of miles. Stealth was critical. Every commander knew that by 1944, Allied anti-submarine coverage extended even into mid-Atlantic. Captain Lieutenant Eck understood the stakes and had been briefed on Germany's uncompromising U-boat directives. He and other U-boat commanders were under orders not to risk their own vessels to aid enemy survivors. After the 1942 Laconia incident, when a U-boat was attacked by Allied aircraft while rescuing shipwreck survivors, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had issued the notorious Laconia Order. This directive explicitly forbade U-boat crews from attempting any rescue of survivors from torpedoed ships, stating, "Rescue runs counter to the rudimentary demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and crews. Be harsh." Eck would later cite this order to justify his actions. But, as events unfolded, he went far beyond merely failing to rescue survivors. He took active measures to exterminate them. U-852's voyage toward the Indian Ocean was uneventful until mid-March 1944. On the night of March 13th, Eck's lookouts sighted a lone merchant vessel. This ship was the SS Peleus, a Greek steam freighter of 4,695 tons, which was operating under charter to the British Ministry of War Transport. Peleus was not in a convoy. She was sailing alone, making her an easy target for a prowling U-boat. Despite his orders to maintain radio silence and avoid unnecessary engagements, Eck decided to attack. Stalking his prey until after nightfall for cover, he maneuvered into firing position. 2 torpedoes sped through the dark sea and struck Peleus, tearing open her hull. Within a short time, the freighter was mortally wounded and began to sink. The Peleus went down, but left behind a broad debris field, shattered timbers, cargo wreckage, and several rafts amid patches of oil. Dozens of sailors from the Peleus had managed to abandon ship in time. The merchant's crew, a mix of nationalities, 18 Greeks, 8 British, and others from Egypt, China, Russia, Chile, and Poland, now found themselves cast into the ocean night. Many were clinging to makeshift rafts or flotsam, frightened but alive. Unbeknownst to them, their ordeal was only beginning. After the torpedo hits, U-8 surfaced near the wreckage. Standard U-boat procedure after a sinking was to question survivors for the ship's name, cargo, and destination, useful intelligence to report back to headquarters. Eck's crew located a drifting survivor and hauled him close enough to inquire about the ship's identity and voyage. Having confirmed it was the Peleus and gathered whatever information they could, the Germans faced a decision. Normally, at this point, a U-boat might depart the scene, leaving survivors to their fate. But Eck was alarmed by the extent of the debris and the presence of survivors. He realized that floating wreckage and rafts could linger for days, a telltale beacon for Allied patrol aircraft, or ships that a U-boat had been in the area. In these waters, Allied planes from West Africa or Ascension Island occasionally scoured for subs. Eck feared that at daybreak, any patrolling aircraft would spot the oil slick and bobbing rafts, potentially bringing swift retaliation. Captain Lieutenant Eck made a fateful and gruesome decision to eliminate all traces of the Peleus sinking, including the survivors. He announced his decision to his officers, some of whom were taken aback. Chief Engineer Oberleutnant Hans Lenz immediately protested, telling his captain that he was not in agreement with this order. But Eck was resolute. He curtly replied that he was determined to carry it out, and Lenz's objections were overruled. The mood on the bridge was tense and grim. Eck later admitted he told the crew, with a heavy heart, that he had made the decision to destroy the wreckage. Despite any personal misgivings, the officers prepared to obey their commander. Under Eck's orders, the U-boat's deck machine gun was brought to bear on the floating wreckage and clustered castaways. What followed was an appalling episode of cold-blooded warfare. U-852's officers and select crew opened fire into the darkness, spraying the rafts and debris with automatic weapons. Tracer rounds lit up the night as bullets ripped through wood and flesh alike. Some survivors screamed, others slipped silent beneath the waves. Not satisfied with gunfire alone, Eck instructed his men to also throw hand grenades into the clusters of survivors. The concussions of grenade blasts sent geysers of water and shrapnel across the oil-slicked sea. One by one, the fragile makeshift rafts were punctured and sinking, and the cries of the wounded faded. Below decks, most of the crew remained at their stations, spared from witnessing the full horror. On the conning tower and upper deck, however, several of Eck's officers personally took part. Oberleutnant Lenz, the very man who had objected, found himself in a bizarre moral position. Initially, Lenz had gone below, likely to record the survivors' statements in the log, avoiding participation. But when he returned topside, he saw a young enlisted machinist, Wolfgang Schwender, preparing to fire the machine gun at Eck's command. Perhaps to spare the enlisted man, or to ensure the job was done properly, Lenz took the machine gun from Schwender's hands and fired it himself in the general direction of the floating target. The engineer officer who opposed the atrocity ended up directly participating in it, a fact that would weigh heavily in post-war judgments. Also among the shooters was Dr. Walter Weiss-Pfennig, the U-boat's medical officer, who grabbed a firearm and joined in the attack. As a naval doctor, Weiss-Pfennig was a non-combatant by law, forbidden from offensive use of weapons, but in that moment he followed Eck's orders without open hesitation. The boat's second in command, Lieutenant August Hoffmann, likewise took part in the machine gunning. Finally, after expending ammunition and explosives, U-852's crew saw no more movement among the debris. Eck was convinced he had erased the evidence of his attack. He ordered a last sweep of the area, then turned his U-boat away from the scene of carnage. In the darkness, U-852 crept off to the south, resuming its voyage toward the Cape. The entire Peleus affair had lasted only a matter of hours, but it would taint the crew for a lifetime. Against all odds, 3 men from the SS Peleus survived the U-boat's deadly purge. In the chaos of bullets and explosions, these men had managed to avoid immediate death, perhaps by hiding among wreckage or playing dead in the water. The survivors were the Greek first officer of the Peleus, 1 Greek seaman and 1 British seaman. Once the submarine left and the night grew quiet, they found themselves alone on the open ocean. The U-boat's crew had smashed or sunk most of the rafts, but a few pieces of flotsam remained, bits of wreckage just enough to keep the men afloat. For 25 excruciating days, these shipwrecked sailors drifted under the burning sun and cold stars of the mid-Atlantic. They were at the mercy of ocean currents and fate. They suffered from extreme thirst, exposure, and hunger. The men likely survived on rainwater, or whatever provisions they could scrape from floating debris. Every day was a struggle not to succumb to dehydration or despair. One can only imagine their hopeless thoughts, having seen comrades mercilessly gunned down, and yet they persevered. Miraculously, after more than 3 weeks adrift, salvation arrived. A Portuguese merchant ship crossing the Atlantic spotted the castaways and hauled them aboard, alive but emaciated. The neutral Portuguese vessel delivered the survivors to safety, likely to a port in West Africa or Brazil, where they could finally recount what had happened on that night. Their testimony was chilling. They described how a German submarine had surfaced, interrogated them, then systematically tried to kill every survivor with machine guns and grenades. The story of the Peleus survivors quickly reached Allied authorities. It was clear that a war crime had occurred at sea, a blatant violation of the laws and customs of warfare. Armed with the survivors' accounts, the Allies were determined to identify and bring to justice the U-boat crew responsible for the Peleus massacre. But first, they had to find the culprit, a difficult task in the vast ocean with only fragmentary clues. All the survivors could say was that a U-boat sank their ship on March 13th, 1944. Although Eck had tried to leave no witnesses, he could not hide his movements from Allied eyes forever. After the Peleus incident, U-852 continued southward. On April 1st, 1944, 2 weeks after the Peleus, Eck intercepted another lone Allied merchant ship, the British steamer Dahomean off the coast of South Africa. He torpedoed and sank this vessel as well, but this time he did not linger or attack survivors. It seems Eck was not eager to repeat the atrocity, now that he was closer to Allied-controlled waters near the Cape. By late April, U-852 had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the western reaches of the Indian Ocean. The British, alert to U-boat incursions in those waters, maintained aerial patrols from bases in Aden and East Africa. On April 30th, 1944, U-852 was spotted by a Royal Air Force patrol plane, a Vickers Wellington bomber flying out of Aden. The aircraft swooped in, catching the submarine on the surface. Crucially, her pressure hull was compromised, meaning the U-boat could no longer dive. Eck and his crew found themselves in a dire predicament. A crippled submarine, stuck on the surface in hostile waters, with more enemy aircraft surely on the way. Over the next day, the RAF intensified the assault. Eck attempted a desperate gambit. He steered toward the African coastline of present-day Somalia, hoping to beach the U-boat and save his crew. Under repeated bombing runs, U-852 ran aground on a coral reef near Ras Maba on the Somali coast, just north of a village called Bandar Bela. There, pounded by surf and bombs, the U-boat was finished. Eck ordered scuttling charges set, and the crew scuttled and blew up the submarine's wreck on the reef on May 3rd to prevent any intact technology from falling into enemy hands. Out of U-852's crew of 65 men, 7 were killed during the air attacks and beaching. The remaining 58 men scrambled ashore, weary and shaken, but alive. They found themselves in a remote, arid shore of Somaliland. There would be no escape by sea. Allied naval forces would soon arrive, so the Germans attempted to hide or flee inland. Local British officered units, including the Somaliland Camel Corps and indigenous militia, swiftly converged on the landing site. Within a short time, Eck and his surviving crew were captured on the beaches or nearby. When British forces searched the wreck of U-852, they made several notable discoveries. Amid the twisted hull, they found the collapsed FAR 330 Backstelze, providing the Allies their first concrete look at this novel German recon device. More importantly, a Royal Navy boarding party recovered Captain Lieutenant Eck's war diary and other documents from the U-boat. That log, alongside the statements of survivors and crew, would soon become damning evidence. With U-852's crew in custody as prisoners of war, the British authorities began a thorough investigation into the Peleus incident. Interrogations soon corroborated what the Peleus survivors had described. In fact, engineer Hans Lenz gave a full written confession while in prison, detailing the order and how it was carried out. Combined with the 2 surviving Greeks' eyewitness testimonies and the U-boat's recovered log entries, which likely noted the encounter with Peleus, the Allies amassed an airtight case. They prepared to put the perpetrators on trial for violating the laws of war by killing unarmed survivors at sea. In October 1945, barely 5 months after Germany's surrender, a British military court in Hamburg convened to hear the case of United Kingdom vs. Heinz-Wilhelm Eck, soon dubbed the Peleus Trial. The accused were Heinz-Wilhelm Eck, Lieutenant zur See August Hoffmann, Dr. Walter Weisspfennig, engineer Hans Lenz, Wolfgang Schwender, an enlisted machinist. They were jointly charged with committing a war crime in that they, in the Atlantic Ocean on the night of the 13th and 14th of March 1944, as captain and members of the crew of U-852, which had sunk the steamship Peleus, were concerned in the killing of members of the crew of the said steamship, Allied nationals, by firing and throwing grenades at them. In plain terms, they were accused of murdering shipwreck survivors, a clear breach of the laws and usages of war. The trial lasted only 4 days, 17th to the 20th of October 1945, indicating how straightforward the evidence was. The prosecution opened by laying out the facts: the sinking of Peleus, the surfacing of U-852, and the deliberate machine gunning and grenading of the survivors, which resulted in all but 3 of the 35 crew of Peleus being killed. Those 3 survivors drifted for over 25 days before rescue. The courtroom heard harrowing witness accounts confirming that Eck's crew had indeed opened fire on defenseless men in the water. In their defense, Heinz-Wilhelm Eck and his men did not deny that the shootings took place. The facts were incontrovertible. Even Eck took the stand and admitted all the acts alleged in the charge. Instead, the defense's strategy hinged on justification and obedience. Eck claimed that what he did was operationally necessary, an unfortunate necessity of war to prevent detection of his U-boat. He referenced the Laconia incident, recounting how a U-boat, commanded by Hartenstein, that had rescued survivors, was betrayed by a plane that attacked it despite a Red Cross flag. Eck argued that after hearing of that incident, he was convinced that military reasons came before human reasons in this war, and thus he felt justified in taking ruthless measures. The other defendants, Hoffmann, Weisspfennig, Lenz, and Schwender, mainly leaned on the classic defense of superior orders. They contended that they were following their commander's directives, which they as military personnel were bound to do. In essence, the junior men argued, "We had no choice. Our captain ordered it, and in wartime, a subordinate cannot safely refuse an order." One notable courtroom moment came with the testimony of Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee, a highly decorated U-boat commander, whom the defense called as an expert witness. Schnee had been on Admiral Dönitz's staff and was intended to bolster Eck's argument that commanders might feel compelled to eliminate evidence under certain circumstances. However, under cross-examination, the British prosecutor put Schnee in a bind, either justify Eck's actions or admit they were beyond the pale. Ultimately, Schnee conceded that he would not have done what Eck did. After hearing both sides, the judges were unequivocal. In his summing up, the judge advocate told the court they should not be distracted by arguments of military necessity or complex points of international law. The act of firing on helpless shipwreck survivors was fundamentally against the usage of war and could not be excused. On October 20th, 1945, the British military court found all 5 defendants guilty of the war crime as charged. In weighing the degrees of culpability, the tribunal considered each man's role and any mitigating factors. However, the gravity of the crime, the cold-blooded killing of unarmed survivors, called for stern punishment. Heinz-Wilhelm Eck, as captain and the one who gave the order, bore the greatest responsibility. August Hoffmann, his second-in-command, had also enthusiastically carried out and enabled the order, and Dr. Walter Weiss-Pfennig, though a junior officer, had violated his protected status as a medical officer by willingly participating in the killing. The court regarded these 3 as most blameworthy. Accordingly, the court pronounced that Eck, Hoffmann, and Weiss-Pfennig were to suffer death, all 3 sentenced to execution by firing squad. Lenz was sentenced to life imprisonment, and Schwender to 15 years imprisonment. On the morning of November 30th, 1945, in a secluded area near Hamburg, Kapitän-Leutnant Eck, Dr. Weiss-Pfennig, and Lieutenant Hoffmann were executed by a British naval firing squad. Heinz-Wilhelm Eck, at age 29, became the only German U-boat commander executed for war crimes in World War II. His 2 officers met the same fate together with him, ending the lives of the trio who had led and carried out the Peleus atrocity. Meanwhile, Lenz and Schwender were shipped off to serve their prison terms. They were not imprisoned for long. The geopolitical tides shifted in the post-war years, and many war criminals had their sentences commuted. Lenz was released in 1952, and Schwender was released in 1951 after about 6 years. The U-852 Peleus incident holds a distinct place in World War II history as a stark example of the limits of military necessity in wartime. It was the only case in which Kriegsmarine U-boat personnel were convicted of war crimes during the Second World War. Thousands of combatants from the Nazi Wehrmacht were prosecuted for atrocities on land, but the men of U-852 were unique among their naval peers. The case set a clear precedent that even in the ferocity of naval warfare, there are lines that must not be crossed. The long-standing customs of the sea demanded that helpless survivors be treated humanely. While submarines were not expected to rescue enemies, especially after incidents like Laconia, actively hunting down survivors was deemed inexcusable. The British Tribunal's rejection of Eck's operational necessity defence was a strong statement that adhering to the laws of war outweighs any presumed tactical advantage gained by such brutality. In the annals of World War II, Kapitän-Leutnant Heinz-Wilhelm Eck's name is not remembered for bold naval victories. His U-boat sank only 2 ships, but for the atrocious crime that followed one of those sinkings. The war crimes of U-852 remind us that even in total war, humanity must prevail. The oceans, often merciless by nature, have long had a code of mercy among sailors. By shattering that code, Eck sealed his own fate. His execution, a rare instance of paying the ultimate price for a battlefield atrocity, reinforced the enduring law of war. To be shipwrecked is to be out of the fight, and to deliberately kill survivors is murder, not war.